I grew up in the Saskatchewan prairies where the dry August air breathed sage and grain dust. I was born into a middle-class white family. I was a rebellious middle daughter to a nuclear family which was provided for by my father's mixed grain and cattle farm. My mother stayed home to raise us and later became a substitute teacher. She canned garden vegetables and cooked roast on Sundays. My worldview was as flat and homogenous as the prairie town where I attended school. There were 3 Indigenous youth in my class, all adopted into white middle-class families, and 1 Chinese family who ran a local diner. My brother later married into this family. I didn't know the term settler. I'd never considered that the hillside where I played was anything other than my family's farmland. The significance of Indigenous people in my life was only in a historical context, and the piece of pasture and the rock and the hilltop, not a half-mile from my house, where my father brought home a hammerhead rock with a line carved through the middle and took us out to show us teepee rings left behind in the rocks scattered amongst the buffalo sage. I knew nothing about where these people went. I became a single mother around the age of 19. In the context of the community and the generation I was raised in, it was a pretty big deal, and it may be a factor in distancing myself from my early roots to some degree. This life event indirectly led me to teach in the community of Duck Lake and to meet the relations that have a significant role in my life. One of the most powerful teachings I've been given is the flexible definition and role of relations in First Nations community. I was taught that you can take someone as your relation to fill the needs in your life, and in my case I was blessed to be asked to sit as an elder's wife during doctoring and sweats, and from this I was blessed with teachings and responsibilities, but also with a beautiful family for the majority of my adult life. The Sesaquasis family is a traditional family from Beardy's Okamesa's Cree Nation, and the family life centers around the sweat lodge, golf, and family meals. And I was fortunate to be adopted in the traditional sense. I was once told by the elder in the loveliest way that I had been drawn to the sweat because I played with the grandfathers on the hilltop as a child. I'm also aware that I have the privilege of walking in both worlds, and with this comes a great responsibility to the people that I love. I worked as a high school English teacher in a provincial school just outside of a larger reserve community for 14 of my 16 teaching years. 90% of the population were First Nations, and I had a lot to learn. I was privileged to work under an incredible administrator, and I developed units from the First Nations Métis education branch and piloted them. I was granted a lot of leeway in my practice, and I was encouraged to seek knowledge from the community. I got to work cooperatively with an elder in my classroom, and I learned the value of storytelling, experiential learning, and most importantly, relationships. My students formed a drum and dance group and attended monthly sweats. The highlight of my career, though, was facilitating a student-led anti-racism cross-cultural training team, which took my team all across Canada, and even allowed us the opportunity to speak at the International World Peace Forum. The growth of my students was immeasurable. They became passionate advocates for the voice in education, and many of them become teachers today. I self-situate as a teacher who experienced the value of Indigenous ways of knowing and on the growth of my students that I taught. I did not hear the term ally in reference to Indigenous people until I returned to university years later, but I now situate myself as an ally. I was blessed with the opportunity to take a mid-career break for 3 years, and I used this time to travel extensively overseas. I learned so many valuable life lessons and participated in amazing opportunities. I worked with families building homes in Kerala, India, and sanitation facilities in the slums of Ethiopia. I taught at an orphanage in Bali, and I backpacked and traveled along with my son for his gap year. Travel is one of the most transformative experiences, but at the end of this journey, I knew I still had a calling in Canada. I've been privy to conversations from a Western philosophy of deficit thinking about Indigenous education and the fix-it mentality that programs and funding schemes often come from. I've seen the implementation of structured initiatives succeed or fail based on its ability to allow flexibility to adapt to the community values and reflect Indigenous ways of knowing. I have a strong belief in First Nations control over First Nations education, and I want to see this succeed. Currently, I'm an education coordinator at the Saskatoon Tribal Council. I've been working here for 4.5 years under a precarious annual funding grant program called First Nations Student Success Program. I work for federal schools, which are under community control, and the decisions and policies are made by Chief and Council, who have agreed to work collaboratively as a member of the Tribal Council. I've been fortunate to participate in initiatives that continue to support Indigenous youth. I worked as a home instructor for parents of preschool youngsters, a career education coordinator. I facilitated Indigenous science and heritage fairs, and I participated in land-based learning opportunities, but for the most of the time I provide professional development for teachers and coordinate assessments which are used to collect data on student achievement. The data that I collect belongs to the communities and is kept in the community, and I take an aggregate view of this and support planning and policy making. This data is not reflected in the ministry's FMNI statistics, but it does paint a similar picture of the current crisis in First Nations education. Communities have been collaborating to create an education alliance based on trauma-informed practices. The new ISC funding has been allocated to bands at a per-student ratio, which on the surface appears to be closing the funding gap between First Nations and non-First Nations the student spending. This, however, comes at a loss of programs that support collaborative efforts of tribal councils. The reality is that most of our communities will take a loss of funding overall. Communities will be given the choice to form an alliance which fits into the ministry's narrow view of leadership and mirrors a school division, to join a provincial partner, or to become an independent. Funding through the First Nations Student Success Program will be reallocated to local level in different funding formula. My colleagues and I will be seeking new employment when I return to Canada. I'm so excited to make this trip part of my next step forward in education. I've come to understand that travel is my catalyst for growth and change. I am once again blessed with an opportunity to walk in a new world and learn from a new way of knowing, and I'm eager to see where this journey takes us.